Okay, so we're very lucky to have with us today Bill Mullen of Purdue and the Coalition for Action in Higher Education to sort of welcome us into the session. So Bill, I'm going to, this is me officially handing over to you.
Hey, thanks, Nesrine. Well, welcome everybody, friends and comrades from wherever you are. We are really thrilled that the Radical Caucus is going to kick off to this year's Day of Action with this extraordinary panel on the crisis of displacement from Palestine to Mexico. I'm kind of standing in today for Pat Keaton, who's a member of the Radical Caucus, who couldn't be here today, but is also
recording in progress.
Part of the organizing collective for the Day of Action. And just want to say a couple things about this event. We have now over 200 campus protests unfolding today across the US, from Alaska to Hawaii to New York City. And we have an incredible program of online webinars beginning right now until 9 o'clock tonight. And if you haven't had a chance to register for or see the other sessions that are being offered, if you go to our Day of Action website and the chat there, you can still register for events the rest of the day. We think that this is going to be, we hope, the beginning of the next phase of battle against the ruling class, the monsters that are trying to bring down higher ed, the creeping fascism, all of the things that I think are going to be subjects of conversation today, this morning, and throughout. So I'm just honored to be here. I'm going to hand it back to Nesrine, and really looking forward to hearing the remarkable session today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I'd like to introduce our speakers really briefly before I turn over to them, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're speaking. Our first speaker is going to be Barbara Foley, who is our fearless leader at the Rad Caucus. We are also lucky to have with us William Robinson, who is professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And also we have with us David Markus, who is at NYU. We also have, apologies. Okay, I'm guessing somebody accidentally unmuted. We also have Kristin Bergen, who's an independent scholar, and we have Barbara Bowen, who is at CUNY, and of course myself, who am at Texas Tech, and I'll be the last to speak. So without further ado, Barbara, I'll hand over to you. You might be having some technical difficulties. Okay. You're still muted, Barbara. You're muted, so you have to hit the unmute. There we go.
Better?
Yes.
When will I learn? Okay. Anyhow, I just want to thank Paul and the crew he's been working with to pull together this incredible Day of Action, which we who are in support of Palestine and against imperialism, et cetera, are thrilled to be able to feel that we're part of this, this movement. And it takes effort and time to build that movement. And thanks for everyone who's been pulling this together. Okay, what I'm going to give you today is a very brief history of the MLA Radical Caucus. And MLA refers to the Modern Language Association. I'll then describe our current Keywords project and close with an invitation to participate in a series of reading groups that's open to anyone who's attending this gathering. The Radical Caucus formed in 1968 during the height of protests against the war in Vietnam, and its first action was a sit-in at the MLA convention held in the Americana Hotel in New York. Over the next decades, the Red Caucus regularly organized convention sessions on pedagogy that focused on working class women's and what were then called minority literatures. We were substantially ahead of the canon busting curve. In terms of politics, we were and are a diverse bunch of leftists. Some Red Caucus members describe themselves as socialists or communists, but for all of us, the critique of capitalism is the common bottom line. Most of our activism in the MLA has involved raising resolutions about urgent issues of the day. These have included, I can't be exhaustive, U.S. intervention in El Salvador and Somalia, as well as the war in Iraq, opposition to racist screeds like Charles Murray's The Bell Curve, support for students protesting institutional racism at various places, including Hostos College right here in New York City, opposition to welfare cutbacks, making college attendance near impossible for low-income women, repudiation of California's notorious Proposition 187, condemnation of the term illegal alien, and advocacy on behalf of undocumented college students before they were called dreamers. Repudiation of the anti-communist initiatives undertaken by various right-wing actors, including the so-called Academic Student Bill of Rights sponsored by David Horowitz, a progenitor of today's Canary Mission, which we're quite familiar with. On the economic front, the Rad Caucus supported the 1995 Yale graduate student strike, advocated for grad student unionization at a time when this was not popular or fashionable, and worked with other humanities organizations to achieve greater security and wage parity for the part-time and adjunct college teachers constituting increasingly the academic precariat. And finally, it was the Rad Caucus that back in 2008 sponsored the successfully ratified resolution supporting the teaching of Palestinian literature and culture. In 2024, the Rad Caucus organized a coalition of more than a dozen MLA divisions in support of an emergency motion calling for the defense of academic freedom of pro-Palestinian faculty and student advocates. This motion was passed through the Delegate Assembly by a resounding margin, only to be blocked at the level of the Executive Council. The Rad Caucus undertook these and other initiatives because we envisioned the MLA not as some kind of intrinsically humanist terrain, but instead as a site of struggle. Leadership of the MLA has consistently attempted to undermine any efforts to link the life of the mind to the struggle in the street. In 1988, the Constitution was changed so that the association was forbidden to take positions on wars and social policies not directly related to the academy. I recall a particularly ironic moment in the early 1990s when we could not condemn war in Iraq, only the language used in its justification by such terms as collateral damage and war against terror. Oh, and parenthetically, the person who was chairing that meeting was no one other than Edward Said, who was terrible with parliamentary procedure, but where his heart lay was very clear, and he was really cringing at the restrictions placed upon the Rad Caucus in this particular debate. Anyhow, after the successful passage of the pro-Palestinian resolution, the MLA Executive Council proposed in 2010 an amendment to the Constitution requiring a much higher percentage of votes in favor of ratification of any resolution. When pro-Palestinian advocates first sought the MLA's endorsement of BDS in 2017, the Executive Council engineered a substitute resolution condemning academic boycotts. The result? Scores of members defected from the MLA. Thus, when in the fall of 2024, the MLA Executive Council refused to bring a second BDS resolution before the Delegate Assembly, not even to have it discussed, we in the Rad Caucus were dismayed, but hardly surprised. Nor were we surprised when even more people quit the MLA. Anyhow, let me fast forward to the current moment. The Rad Caucus continues to sponsor convention sessions. Most of us have decided to stay and struggle. Given the horrific wave of neo-McCarthyism that has been washing over the campuses, which is going to be talked about today, there remains much political work to be done in professional academic associations. We have, however, broadened both our scope of activity and our constituency. In part, this is because we wish to continue to work with those teachers and scholars who have abandoned the MLA as hopelessly reactionary. Our pandemic-era experience in hosting a number of keywords Zoom sessions, similar to today's discussion of displacement, reflects our awareness that the Rad Caucus interest in the politics and effects of language is widely shared by many people who are not in the academy, who are in fact quite cynical about the academy as a site of change. You don't need to be an English professor or graduate student, in other words, much less a member of the MLA to join the MLA Rad Caucus. And in addition, we have recently instituted a series of reading groups on books relevant to the current crisis. Our last one addressed Maya Wen's important critique of Israeli universities in her Hours of Ivory and Steel. And the next reading group will examine the politics of borders. So we urge anyone who would like to work with the Rad Caucus to indicate this in the chat and communicate with our chair, Jordy Miller, whose contact information has been posted there. The current move to overt fascism in the academy and beyond requires urgently that we rise to the occasion.
Every time you don't.
Barbara, I'm afraid you muted.
Well, I had finished.
Okay.
And I heard somebody chiming in, so I thought I was muting everything. I am no tech wizard.
Either.
Okay, let's move on here. Sorry.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I believe our next speaker is William, whenever you're ready. And I'll remind everybody to mute their mics when they join the session at first, because we're hearing some of your background noises unintentionally.
I think I've unmuted. Yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Nesrine, Barbara Foley, and others who have organized this this session, and for inviting me. I'm going to jump right into this. I'm going to time myself at 7 minutes. Oh, wait a minute. Too early in the morning here. It is. So sorry, everyone. I thought I had this set up. It's 7 a.m. here. I'm still waking up. So maybe someone, Nesrine, you can just interrupt me when it's 7 minutes. That doesn't work. So I'm going to jump right into this. Rather than focus on a specific case of displacement, what I want to do is present the big picture, the global picture that frames displacement. And for me, this incredibly deep, at the deepest structural level, displacements all displacements that are taking place around the world emanate from this epochal crisis of global capitalism. And that's the fundamental backdrop to everything that's going on in the world today, from Trumpism to trade wars to fascism to genocide to geopolitical conflict. And I would suggest that we focus on four interwoven dimensions of this crisis. The first, of course, is economic or structural, deep crisis of overaccumulation, and it's getting worse. But the second is a crisis worldwide of social reproduction. Social disintegration and social collapse is spreading all around the world, and that can be explained in the context of this epochal crisis of global capitalism. The third dimension is a crisis around the world of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony, and of geopolitical conflict. There's the political dimension, if we want to say, structural, social, political, and of course the environmental dimension. We're facing the collapse of the biosphere, which makes this crisis existential. I want to say something here now, link the structural dimension or the economic dimension of the crisis to displacement. And again, we're seeing unprecedented overaccumulation crisis. Global markets are saturated and they're getting more saturated. Massive industrial overcapacity has been building up for 15 or more years now. The rate of profit has been declining since the late 1990s, since the turn of the century. So it's this chronic stagnation in the globally integrated economy that generates this intense pressure for expansion. The capitalist system has to violently expand outward at this time. And so what I refer to as the transnational capitalist class has been in this desperate search to unload surpluses. Where can they continue to unload all of this overaccumulated surpluses? How can the transnational capitalist class open up new opportunities for capital accumulation and sustain profit making? And so this explains, or this has led to this new, what we're experiencing right now, which is a new worldwide round of violent and predatory extractivist expansion, this new wave of primitive accumulation around the world. And it's this expansion which is driving displacement all over the world. And this displacement, plus the expansion and the displacement that it brings about, has to do with, for instance, these campaigns to seize resources and to create new circuits of global accumulation. So we have the case of Gaza, where the Palestinian proletariat in Gaza is completely surplus humanity. Global capitalism has no use whatsoever for the Palestinian proletariat, but they do have use. Global capitalist system wants to get at the gas and the oil and build a canal and real estate in Gaza. And that's part of this wave of expansion and appropriation. In the Congo, 14 million people have either died or been displaced in the past 2.5 decades. And that is a massive displacement, and it's explained also by this dramatic drive to expand and access all of that mineral wealth in the Congo. If we turn to Mexico, I'm just giving a couple of examples, but what I'm trying to say is that this global crisis and the pressures that it builds up is really the underlying structural explanation for all of these displacements. Sheinbaum, the Mexican president Sheinbaum, seems to be a hero to some, but in fact she's opened up the country to a much deeper wave of corporate takeover in Mexico, including the Mexican countryside, and these mega projects and infrastructural projects in southern Mexico have been displacing and continue to displace hundreds of thousands of indigenous and peasant communities in Indonesia and Malaysia. Massive, unprecedented land grabs and grabs of forests. So all of this are the different phases of displacement driven by this round of appropriation expansion in the face of stagnation and over accumulation. Also, I want to stress here that processes of displacement themselves are also profitable, are also outlets for the actual process of displacing. And this is what I call militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression, which become wars, conflict, transnational social control, displacement, etc., become in themselves strategies of accumulation. So the war on immigrants going on in the United States right now, we know, is massively profitable. And that war is organized by the US state, but turned over to private transnational capital. We're all familiar with Geo Group and Core Group, and there's this massive investment now for a whole string of new detention centers and all kinds of other social control mechanisms that are going to private corporations. And this didn't start with Trump. Biden handed over 21,000 contracts to private transnational corporations to carry out the war on immigrants. That was Biden, before Trump even came into power. The Homeland Security budget is expected to rise to $30 billion by 2030. And believe it or not, Trump, it's unbelievable figures. Trump just proposed spending $45 billion to expand ICE detention centers, which of course is this immigrant gulag is run for profit by private transnational capital. So what we're seeing around the world in this context is the fusion of state-organized violence and militarized accumulation with private transnational capital. You all know, we're following the headlines that Blackwater is now in Ecuador, running a private army alongside with the state army to displace and repress and control the population. We know the story of El Salvador and Blackwater there. In 2024, U.S. arms exports at a record high of $318 billion. That's a 29% increase over 2023. So Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere are really gifts. They're blessings for transnational capital to attempt to expand in other ways, in militarized ways, in the face of chronic stagnation. All around the world, military budgets are increasing and increasing very rapidly. There's this intensive expansion of the militarization of the global economy and society. We have been living in a global war economy, and that's becoming more and more evident and more central to this whole story. And so remember that this militarization, it is accumulation. Militarization itself and repression itself is accumulation, and it is also the mechanism for displacement that we are discussing here. So the second thing, how am I doing on time, Nesrine? I've lost track. Okay, the second thing is social reproduction. And here, remember that surplus capital has this alter ego in surplus labor, in the radical expansion of the ranks of surplus humanity. The transnational capitalist class has no need for the social reproduction of major sectors of the global working classes. And right now, this digital revolution, which is well underway, involves a radical transformation of global capitalism, involving a radical and a massive expansion of the ranks of surplus humanity. And here we're not just talking about industrial workers in the North, but also in the South. The global South is automating with this technology as we speak. And moreover, it also involves, whether we want to call them knowledge workers, white-collar workers, professional managerial class, there is this generalized precaritization, which is already well underway and will be accelerated radically with the technological and artificial intelligence revolution, which is already going to intensify, sweeping away unskilled and skilled labor, manual and mental labor. This, we've heard so much about it, but when we study it, it's not hyperbole. It is not even just the future. It's right now. China at this time has fully lights out factories. It's gone from half an hour to make an iPhone with human beings to 1 minute to make an iPhone with lights out factories. That means you don't need to turn the lights on because there's no human beings. Even mining in China and elsewhere is being fully automated. So the challenge that the ruling groups face here is, how do they contain surplus humanity? How do they manage restless working classes that are facing displacement all over the world? And so we have these nightmarish strategies of containment from above, violent class warfare to contain us, the global working class, from above. And there's three options they turn to. The first is what I call the Gaza option. You have surplus humanity that you don't need whatsoever, and so genocide. That's the face of Gaza, but also elsewhere, possibly in Kashmir that's coming, and other places. The second option the ruling groups have for containment and control is what I call the Salvadoran option, the spread of mega imprisonment worldwide. We find now that it's in the news, so everyone knows about 40,000 people housed in one giant mega prison, the Secot. But in fact, other countries all around the world in the last 3, 4, 5 years have looked at the Salvadoran example and said, we want to do the same. So you have these new geographies worldwide of mega imprisonment as a way of responding and containing surplus humanity. The foreign minister of Costa Rica just last week went to visit this mega prison in El Salvador, went back to his country in Costa Rica and said, yeah, we have a problem too with surplus humanity. Of course, he didn't say surplus humanity. He said terrorists and criminals. And so we're going to build mega prisons along the Salvadoran model. So that's the second option that the ruling groups have. The third option is simply—
If I can interrupt you there, and perhaps we can return to some of these in the chat, in the subsequent chat. I just want to make sure we have enough time.
How many minutes have I gone?
10.
Oh, 10, really?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so I'll wrap it up in about 20 seconds here. I thought you'd let me know when it was 7 minutes. That's what I was trying to do on my phone. So I just want to say in conclusion, then, the third option here is simple abandonment. And you see that all over the world. Contain people through digital and physical walls and other mechanisms, but you're simply abandoned. So, for instance, we have over 100,000 people dying in the opioid epidemics in the United States. That's abandonment. When 200,000 federal workers are now fired, that's a form of abandonment. And anyway, I'm sorry I went over. I thought the 7-minute warning would give me a minute or so to wrap it up. So that's as far as I get. Thank you.
That's fine. I will ask speakers to keep an eye on the chat because that's where I'm trying to unobtrusively signal time. But it's hard to do that and focus on your paper, so it's completely understandable. Okay, I will hand over to David now. David, if you're ready.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really happy to be here today. My background, as some of you may be able to see here, is Foley Square next to the courthouse in downtown Manhattan. I hope that if you're in New York today, you'll join us at 4 p.m. to say hands off our students, hands off higher ed. So when Tony asked me to present on this panel, the suggestion was that I reflect on the psychoanalytic meaning of the term displacement. I've gathered my provisional thoughts under the title A Grim Poetics. And I should say also that these notes are part of a larger project in which I'm reckoning with current events from the perspective of someone whose father survived the Holocaust as a hidden child in the Netherlands and subsequently became a leader in the Zionist youth movement. Rosh Hashanah 2024, a year into the genocide in Gaza, Exchanges with my dad's aging first cousin Rivka in the north of Israel. She and her family are displaced because of rocket fire from southern Lebanon. They spend their days in state-assisted comfort on the Sea of Galilee, watching the storks migrate, waiting to return home to their beloved kibbutz. I ask oblique questions and get disappointing answers. Not more than 150 miles south, Gazans ground down by forced starvation undertake what journalists describe as death marches. Men and women tread barefoot through the treacherous landscape. Children carry their siblings on their back. Grandmothers collapse in the dust. Displacements beget displacement. Rivka is the daughter of my grandfather's brother, Henri, the only brother of three to survive Nazi persecution. Devastated by the war, her family arrived in Tel Aviv on May 14th, 1948, Israeli Independence Day. That is, one day prior to Nakba Day, commemorating a catastrophe that was already months, years, decades in the making. A formerly hidden child, traumatized and maladjusted, Rivka only eventually found her footing in Israeli society through the communal life she discovered at Kibbutz Sasa, a former Arab village whose population was massacred and whose agricultural production was long ago eclipsed by a thriving military-industrial factory. Rivka and her husband have lived there for the past 60 years, both burdened and unburdened by history. Yitzhar Smolansky, reflecting on the ethnic cleansing of 48, which he witnessed and translated into fiction, poses the still urgent question. But those who would end up living here in this village, would the walls not scream in their ears? Apparently not, or the screams go unheard. And yet one senses that the horrors of 48 have not left its beneficiaries unscathed. In the words of Jacques Lacan, the subject cries out through his symptom, as Christ said that stones themselves would have cried out had the children of Israel not lent them their voices. For Sari Makdisi, denial, what Freud termed Verleugnung, is symptomatized by Zionism's performance of occlusive affirmations, its delusory self-proclaimed tolerance and democracy, its frenzied afforestation of graveyards. Displacement, or Verschiebung, is a more slippery term within the Freudian lexicon, quite literally denoting the slippage between signifiers. In an essay written for an Amnesty talk on displacement, asylum, and migration, Jacqueline Rose moves quickly from geographic and political to psychoanalytic concerns. Displacement, she notes, signals the basic discovery of psychoanalysis, that the mind cannot be held to one place. In dreams, one image is charged with the intensity of another, often one that the dreamer would prefer not to face. Of European Jews arriving in Palestine, Rose notes that from displacement to projection is a single step. I have come in flight from a country where I could never have even set eyes on you, yet you are the one now today who will be answerable for my fear. Enzo Traverso colloquializes Freud's economic hypothesis. It was the Palestinians, he writes, who paid and continue to pay Europe's debt toward the Jews. For those inheritors among us of the post-structuralist tradition, for better and for worse, I say to my Radical Caucus comrades, one cannot hear displacement without it conjuring another term from Freud's interpretation of dreams, namely condensation or Verdichtung, and with it the subsequent coupling of metaphor and metonymy in the work of Roman Jakobson and Lacan. To put it all too briefly, condensation, which for Freud denotes the compressive and combinatory nature of dream imagery, is associated with metaphor, with the vertical substitution of one word for another, with the poetic function, hence the Dichtung in Verdichtung, and finally for Lacan, with the symptom, the outward expression or signification of an underlying trauma. Displacement, by contrast, is associated with metonymy, the horizontal connection and transfer of signification between more or less contiguous signifiers, and importantly, with the enigmas of desire. Lacan will therefore speak of the subject becoming caught in the rails of metonymy, its desire eternally extending toward the desire for something else. This stuff is old hat in literary studies, but the Iranian-born psychoanalyst and scholar Sadek Rahimi breathes new life into these concepts in his effort to situate Lacan's thinking within a mode of contemporary political subjectivity. He describes the metaphoric function as a hauntology, a semi-permeable passage through which the past is able to invade or possess the present. Meanwhile, the metonymic function is that syntactic cohesion of language thought expressed through chains of signification, which constantly struggles to avoid that which calls from the past. What does all this have to do with Europe's debt to the Jews paid in Palestinian blood? And I see, Nesrine, one more minute. Is that a 7-minute warning or is it a 6-minute warning? Okay. I'll skip down in that case and suggest that contrary to Rose's thinking, we do not need to go through displacement and projection to transform the victims before us into the persecutors of yesterday. The past haunts the present at every turn. The metaphoric function connects us, as Rahimi writes, in an immediate fashion, one word for another. This is the formula for metaphor, Lacan tells us. Victim for persecutor. This is the grim poetry of occupation. What then of metonymy and displacement? The past haunts the present even as the present attempts at each turn to escape into a messianic future. Recalling that displacement emerges in Freud's thought as a means of foiling censorship, as well as Rahimi's association with metonymy with manic defense, I would offer that displacement in the present context is constituted by the endless chain of ideological assertions through which the state attempts to represent itself to the world by way of what Lacan might call the sophistics of signification. In a word, Hasbara. I'll go one more paragraph and I'll talk less in the discussion. It is through this push and pull of displacement and condensation, metonymy and metaphor, that a project of colonial domination can describe itself as a democratic enterprise, that Hamas is equated with Nazism, that Jewish activists become capos, that the students whose moral courage will be celebrated tomorrow are condemned today as supporters of anti-Semitic terrorism. By outrageously confirming the most elemental psychoanalytic insights and workings of the unconscious, the symptomatology of Zionism, this Gordian knot of symbolic and imaginary servitude, reveals itself with bitter irony as everything Freud's so-called Jewish science set out to untie. Thanks.
Okay, so I think now we have Kristin. Kristin, whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I set my timer, but please cut me off. Okay, so what I'll be talking about comes under the subheading of gentrification. And I'll be speaking in a sort of a much more sociological mode than I'm used to. So here we go. Usually when we think of gentrification, we think of yuppies coming in and driving up rents and driving people out and making everything boring. But I want to begin here with a more expansive formal definition of gentrification, something like the spatial displacement of one class of people by another more powerful or really more profitable class of people in order to, and I'm doing this in order to draw some connections across different sites and types of displacement, from West Philly to the Upper West Side, to the West Coast, to the West Bank, and most of all to Gaza. And I also want to draw connections between the different possibilities for resistance to those various but connected forces of displacement. And also, forgive my voice and for keeping my camera mostly off. I have a cold. And I'll try to flesh this out in my examples, but I want to emphasize from the start that these connections are not based in abstraction, but they're intimately material. So what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my time is the student encampments that began a year ago today as a way of addressing gentrification, the university, and Gaza. We're all familiar with the idea of the university as a primary agent of gentrification, particularly on the urban campuses. The 68 Columbia occupation was partly in resistance to the university's planned expansion into Harlem. And a week after their Gaza Solidarity encampment went up last summer, students at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia, where I'm based, made their own Solidarity encampment, which lasted and expanded for about 3 weeks until it was raided by the Penn police together with the Philly PD. And these two are not entirely distinct because Penn police are themselves part of Philly PD. They're deputized members of the police force, and their jurisdiction, which overlaps with nearby Drexel police force, includes the Penn campus and the surrounding areas. One of those areas had its own encampment the summer before last, the University City Townhomes, UC Townhomes, which was renamed the People's Townhomes. Now, this was a predominantly African-American and immigrant affordable housing community that was slated for demolition to make way for the university's ever-expanding medical research corridor in the area. The townhomes themselves were the result of an earlier gentrification, having been built on the rubble of what had been a thriving Black Bottom neighborhood in the mid-century, but by the 1960s was condemned by the City Housing Authority in the name of urban renewal and slum clearance. The land was redeveloped by a consortium of local universities and hospitals for a private-public research center, which still exists today, with some affordable housing tossed in, which still existed until 2 years ago. And by then, the townhomes had developed into a tight-knit community with good schools and good access to transportation and medical facilities and grocery stores and so on. And townhomes residents organized for years against the eviction and demolition in coalition with students and faculty from Penn and Drexel and local housing activists. And this culminated in an encampment at the townhomes in 2023. And today it's rubble again. Just a few weeks ago, there was a Gaza protest march from Penn and Drexel campuses that ended at the townhomes. And it's heartbreaking to see rubble there now. And like the 1985 Move bombing, also in a Black community near Penn and Drexel campuses, in which the city of Philadelphia bombed itself in order to evict the Black radical Move household, destroying 61 houses and 11 Move members, including 5 children. And the University of Pennsylvania Museum retained the remains of some of these children, and they still have one. It was just released last November, by the way. Townhomes residents were given some money to go elsewhere, just like the Move residents, and the longstanding community was disappeared, dismantled, displaced. I think I'm at about 5 minutes, so this should be on schedule. I've just tried to sketch a picture through the prism of gentrification of what things looked like going into the Penn and the Drexel encampments last summer. Excuse me. And here I want to point out 2 major themes. The displacement of people and communities by university campus expansion. And increasingly, this means medical and engineering research facilities, but also the quote unquote student housing sectors that accrete around them. And 2, the role of the police, both campus and city police, in collaboration with city and university officials and their corporate overlords to control movement through surveillance and violence. Okay, so fast forward to the Gaza Solidarity encampments of last summer. Students and community activists, AKA outside agitators, not most of them, but enough, came to the encampments with knowledge and experience of their university's complicity in not only gentrification of neighborhoods, but the design and manufacture of weapons and the financial and cultural support of genocide, and of the violence that they are willing to enact to repress resistance to these. Those with less experience and knowledge in the encampments got brought up to speed, if not through the teach-ins, then through the violence of the police and of some counter-protesters, and through the betrayals of the administration. I'll skip over some stuff here for a second. Over the course of the encampment, you saw a whole array various police forces at play with a whole array of equipment, technology, and techniques for surveillance and control of access. And I'm going to skip over a ton of material, which I'd be happy to address in the discussion part of this. But I want to suggest that what the encampments at Penn and elsewhere exposed is how the universities are in a perverse way gentrifying themselves. Their behavior during and after the encampments precisely follows the logic of colonialism. They tried to separate the encampment communities into differently privileged classes, students versus non-students. At Columbia, the Columbia students versus the Barnard students, and this is done through ID checks and electronic access restrictions. They controlled physical access to the campuses. Most notably at Columbia, 116th Street was shut down between Broadway and Morningside, Morningside Drive, so that anyone in the community has to walk around the whole campus to get to the subways and buses on Broadway. Finally, they harassed the encampment in petty ways by closing access to nearby bathrooms on campus and other amenities with intrusive fake fire safety inspections and so on. And finally, they violently beat protesters who were trying to occupy a building and dismantled the camp on May 10th of last year. But they didn't stop there. Since then, they've violently raided an off-campus student home and confiscated electronics. They've expelled and suspended students, causing them to lose housing, access to dining and medical services, and jeopardizing visas. And now, of course, campuses all over the country, in collaboration with the federal government, are disappearing students and faculty and researchers either by direct collusion or ineffective protest. Catherine Franke, the former Columbia law professor, has described what's happening there as ethnic cleansing. But we might also attend to the ways our universities are self-gentrifying, clearing the humanities slums to make way for the more profitable STEM public-private partnerships that are located on ever-expanding campuses. And I think I have time for a note. I just think it's been under-acknowledged that all three of the Columbia University professors who were thrown under the bus in the Senate hearings last year are gay, and two of the three expelled students there are gay. And interestingly, University of Pennsylvania was not on the initial list of 60 universities held accountable for their anti-Semitism, but rather for having a trans swimmer on their women's swim team. We'll see how that plays out. In the end, though, the main point of the encampments is not gentrification or anything else but Gaza, not because Gaza outranks all other struggles or even all other genocides, but because the structural location of Palestinians at this conjuncture reveals all the contradictions of colonialism everywhere. The students understand.
Kristin, I'm going to have to stop you there because we've hit the 10-minute mark.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I can wrap this up. The students understand that about Palestinians' structural location, even if the media coverage of their movement does not. As their solidarity with Palestinians deepens, so does their ability to recognize and resist forms of colonialism closer to home. And of course, for some students, Palestine is home. It would be perverse to suggest an analogy between gentrification and genocide, but they are not that far apart as expressions of settler colonial logic of expansion underwritten by violent displacement. And I'll stop there and just say, in conclusion, I think this is all simply class warfare being fought on contested land. And the sooner we all see that, the better. Thanks.
Thank you. And our penultimate speaker is Barbara. So Barbara Bowen, whenever you're ready, please go ahead. Don't know. You're still muted. Yeah, you are still muted, I think.
I think I'm here now. And can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Was not letting me unmute. Sorry. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers of the whole day, and the other panelists. These are really, each one of the talks could be a panel in itself, and they've been so rich. Mine focuses more closely on higher education itself. By the time this day of action is over, 661 U.S. residents will have been deported. That means thousands of people, not just deported, not just those who are deported, but thousands of others whose lives are intertwined with them, radically destabilized. But that number, the most recent daily average under Trump, is 11% lower than the 742 deported daily under Biden in his last year in office. Deportation, violent, state-authorized displacement is nothing new in U.S. policy and global policy, as our first speaker made so clear. As historian Stephen Hahn points out in a recent article, expulsion has been integral to American political and cultural life since the colonizing settlement of the early 17th century, almost always expressing the will of a self-designated community against those accused of threatening its security and integrity. What is new is that the promise of mass deportation is a large part of what got our president elected, that it is being openly directed by extreme right-wing think tanks, that it is occurring to residents of longer standing and living farther from the borders than under Biden, that it is being conducted in defiance of federal law, and that it is a centerpiece of an attack on higher education. As of yesterday, more than 1,300 international students and recent graduates have had their visas revoked, according to the 210 colleges and universities where these students worked and studies. Every one of these students now lives under the threat of immediate violent expulsion. More than 1 million students in the United States are here on F1 or M1 visas. All of them are now living under threat, as are the universities where they are enrolled. While many of the revocations are apparently for violations as minimal as turnstile jumping on the subway or minor traffic violations, others are punishment for alleged dissent on the U.S. And Israeli policy and war on Gaza. Students with active permanent residency and approved visas who have spoken out and organized, however peacefully and thoughtfully, organized in dissent and pro-Palestinian demonstrations, are being bundled into unmarked cars and held as criminals. The sheer cruelty of their treatment is a hallmark of the current administration, and they are being used, as we've all seen, to send a message to every student, worker, and faculty member in U.S. colleges and universities. The message, dissent on Palestine is a crime. Whatever actions we take today, and as a result of today's great event, must find a way to address the emergency of deportation. The labor system of higher education makes colleges and universities particularly vulnerable to strategies of displacement. When 75% of those who teach in colleges and universities are in contingent employment, when graduate employees are particularly vulnerable to funding cuts, when diversity initiatives are literally a lifeline for some students, displacement from programs and positions is a material threat. Displacement of a different kind is also at the center of the Trump administration's animosity to higher education. We should not forget that this president, who is extorting universities on the pretext of combating anti-Semitism, applauded protesters who brandished lighted torches and marched through a university campus chanting, "Jews will not replace us." The sickening, infantile chant could hardly have been more explicit, voicing the fear that white male supremacy was no longer guaranteed in the post-industrial USA. Nominally marching to protest the removal of Confederate monuments, the protesters on the University of Virginia campus intertwined the symbols of fascism and racist terror to deliver a threat, in part, to higher education. Universities are under attack now because they are a center of financial and political power that is not yet fully controlled by the government, even though they ultimately perform the ideological work of the ruling class. But we are under attack because we enable critical analysis of the systems of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, colonialism, genocide, and gendered violence, because we produce research, we learn and teach how to see through lies, because universities, even as they perform the work, the ideological work of reinforcing the current class structure, also create opportunities, in a way like today's, for thinkers on the left to find each other and build alternatives. We are under attack because the students who study systemic forces of history and culture with us are sometimes brave enough to take risks for it. It's the punishment for that courage that is so heartbreaking when we see Mahmoud Khalil violently grabbed by ICE agents when he had the courage to stand up publicly to protest the devastation in Palestine, or Rumeysa Ozturk bundled into an unmarked car by black-clad masked agents because she had the courage to call on her university to take a stand, and now Mohsen Mahdawi, a green card holder who had been a U.S. resident for more than 10 years, snatched at an appointment with immigration officials that was expected to lead toward citizenship. These beautiful, moving young people remind us of the courage that can come from exactly what universities should be doing, teaching how to recognize and criticize systems of oppression. And they show us the power at its best of what universities can do. As Omar El-Akkad writes, one day everyone will always have been against this, speaking about the war in Gaza. These students have the courage to be against the war in Gaza now. What can we do as a national campaign to make sure that not one more is snatched for deportation? Part of the answer to that question is in what's happening today in this National Day of Action. If you haven't looked at the list of events organized for today on campuses across the country, it will give you hope about the formidable creative organizing that is possible. Students, staff, and faculty from campuses from Alaska to Georgia, Minnesota to Hawaii have created organized, powerful protests for today. I especially like the list of demands, including protection for the most vulnerable, that will be pasted on the door of the college president's house at Adelphi University in New York, the anti-fascist office hours at Northwestern, and the Rally My Own Union, the Professional Staff Congress, together with the AAUP organization that David spoke about, that rally that's part of a joint organization today in New York City. But these actions alone are unlikely to be enough to reverse the attack on higher education and the criminalizing of free speech and protest. I want to end by suggesting how we might go forward from here, how we might build on today's event to try to reverse this attack. And always, I would add that the attack on the students themselves, the vulnerable students, and specifically the attempt to silence dissent on Palestine must be centered. I noticed that in some of the fighting back, it's being decentered. Right now, at the moment, I'll just take about a minute longer. Right now is the moment, I would say, when Harvard has taken action and the presidents of Stanford and Princeton have spoken publicly in support. This is the moment to mount a national pressure campaign for every college and university to take a public stand, to denounce the deportations, to protect the vulnerable, to refuse to dismantle diversity programs, and to refuse every single one of Trump's demands to end academic freedom and faculty control of teaching and studying and learning, regardless of the funding threats that he's making. We know that most colleges will do nothing unless, including my own university, they'll do nothing without the protection of collective action. So now certainly something that we could think of coming out of today. What if one thing that comes out of the day would be a national campaign, perhaps including a petition and other kinds of pressure open to all college and university students, faculty, staff, and alumni to press our own universities to take a public position in opposition to the attacks going on right now, to take a stand. It might seem far-fetched to imagine that universities would sign on to a single statement or even similar statements of resistance, but consider how many universities have adopted AAUP's statements on tenure and academic freedom. Approximately 74% of four-year institutions with tenure systems. Imagine if 74% of the colleges and universities in the country took a stand of resistance. We could do much more, and I want to just list a few more things and hope that we can talk about them. There are other actions of resistance. Universities should have to check and report every day on the status of student visas. Students are not given access to that database themselves. They could demand that students have that access. Universities could fund immigration law clinics that provide support for academics and students facing deportation.
Barbara, I'm going to, interrupt you very rudely there. And hopefully we can come back to these.
Okay, yes, I see I'm at 10. Okay, I'm sorry.
And hopefully we can come back to these excellent suggestions in the discussion.
And I have a list. I do have a list for us
And
that
if you could maybe even also post it in the chat, I'm sure people would want to know.
great.
That
Great.
those
I think that's something that we can talk about together, what we could do creatively going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
So I guess my talk kind of happily comes at the end because it'll I think pull together some of the things that were said here, and I'd like to think about the larger links between detaining and displacing populations in the US as well as overseas. And my goal is to sort of outline areas where the methods of controlling different populations converge in a specific set of ideologies, and I'm just sort of thinking through my recent experiences. I recently visited a special exhibit on the entwined histories of incarceration and slavery at the historic New Orleans collection in Louisiana. Titled Captive State, Louisiana and the Making of Mass Incarceration, the exhibition had two main segments. The first moved from the origins of jails in Louisiana as centers for detaining and disciplining enslaved people to their later functions of control through convict leasing and forced prison labor at places like Angola State Prison. The second segment dealt with the overcrowding and unsafe conditions of 20th and 21st century prisons that stemmed from tough on crime legislation in the state. As I walked through the various rooms of the exhibition, I found myself reflecting on the connections between the prison system and its newer, expanded form, the contemporary detention center, which is being touted by the current administration in a similar way to what happened in Louisiana as a solution for dealing with immigrant populations as well as political dissenters, be they labor or anti-genocide activists like Mahmoud Khalil, who I'll add, uncoincidentally, was recently held at an ICE detention center in Louisiana because history repeats itself, and is very much sort of using the language of criminality and terrorists, or labeling these people as criminals and terrorists to justify locking them up. Now, while detention is typically understood as shorter in duration than imprisonment, we are seeing a pipeline from detentions to prisons, as is the case of the Venezuelans deported to the Salvadorian mega prison. And some of you may have seen those images, which are incredibly striking. And we'll talk about maybe some of the historical parallels there at a later point. And in some cases, we're seeing extended detentions. According to ICE data from June 2023, I'm sure it's even worse now, immigrant incarceration sites that hold people the longest include Sherburne County Jail in Minnesota. It's holding people for an average of 259 days. That's pretty much a year, right? With others like low on the list, like Pike County Correctional Facility in Pennsylvania for 65 days, and the Tacoma ICE Processing Center in Washington for 64 days. The two institutions are mostly run by private firms in the US. In both prison and detention centers, we see a convergence of private profit, tough on crime discourse, and the disciplining of people whose labor and or political views are seen as threatening to those in power. Equally as alarming as the gross injustices and harm that these institutions represent is that their similarities point to convergences between US policy internationally and domestically, particularly with regard to civil and human rights. At the same time as the US is policing, imprisoning, detaining, and deporting people within its borders, the issue of displacing immigrant populations, either from the US via deportation or within their homelands via US investment and participation in overseas wars, transcends national boundaries. This is as true of physical incursions, whether it's sort of boots on ground actions or airstrikes, or through the holding of detention centers overseas like Guantanamo, which has remained operational despite the promises of various administrations at this point. I remember this from several administrations now. And it's also true of financial incursions. Whether US money is being siphoned away, within the US, money is being siphoned away from education in the form of cuts to funding, the withholding of grants, and the shift towards contingent labor, while exorbitant sums are funneled toward private military companies. These transactions allow us to connect the dots between displacement and detention, between policing and displacement within the borders or at the borders of the US and the forms it takes overseas. Take, for example, the case of Elbit Systems, an Israeli weapons manufacturer that is directly involved in the detention, murder, and displacement of Palestinians in their occupied homeland. The company has, since the mid-2000s, been awarded hefty contracts by various US administrations, again, various US administrations, to build a virtual so-called smart wall along the border with Mexico in the form of high-tech surveillance towers designed to increase the chance of survival, to decrease the chance of survival and increase the chance of death of undocumented border crossers. Significantly, the company uses technologies of surveillance that were, quote unquote, perfected, as it advertises, on Palestinian civilians in occupied Palestine. Elbit Systems has spent over $1 million lobbying Congress and supporting political campaigns in the US, which has borne fruit in the US government's awarding of contracts to the company and handing over of its border security to, again, a private company overseas at the same time as there seem to be no funds for things like education. I'll wrap up with this last thought. Perhaps in the final analysis, displacement is less about the movement of people from one geographical location to the next and more about their detention in the interests of profit for the few. Maybe it's more about constraining populations, immigrant populations, as well as those calling for a more equitable system, whether from a labor or other political perspectives. We often find ourselves locked in battle against similar powerful interests and tactics of immobilization, a realization that will hopefully spur us to further solidarity, and here. So thank you all for these wonderful talks. And I think we are at this point ready to open the ground for discussion and conversation. Sorry, we're taking a second to, I guess, coordinate all the things. Let me see. I have a message. Okay, well, maybe as we wait for questions, I can yield back some of the time that I horribly stole away from the speakers. So if anybody would like to kind of weigh in or maybe expand on some of the points that you didn't have the chance to do, please feel free to do so.
I'll jump in, but with thanks to you for keeping time. It's hard on Zoom watching my little stopwatch and talking, and so I apologize. And I really would love to have heard more of everybody's talk. But just to maybe kick off some of the discussion about where we go from here, just to talk about a couple of things. I mean, I think it's easier to imagine the ways that we could pressure our institutions to take certain stands than it is to imagine the work we could do collectively. And by we, I mean, especially those of us who are organized as faculty and staff in our unions or other organizations, including the Radical Caucus. I think it's easier to understand or think about putting pressure on the institutions. And there's a list of things I bet we can all think of that would go on what they must do, starting with just publicly opposing the deportations and the revocations of visas. I mean, those are being challenged also every day in court cases and other places, but the universities should be filing amicus briefs and being in there. But in terms of what we do ourselves, I mean, the obvious biggest step would be some kind of withholding of labor. And I think that's something for us to think about. That's our biggest power as workers. But I take that very seriously as somebody who had led a union for 20 years and took strike authorization votes and struggled with that. So I think that's something that we could continue to have on the table. I also, my own union is involved in a mutual aid group where we formed a rapid response committee ourselves with a signal group where we're prepared to go and respond. We have mutual aid provisions for people who are vulnerable, information and various things. Those things could be spread more nationally. And I'd also like to think of in addition to the immediate support, what we might do towards the future. I mean, is this an opportunity or a call for us to create a different kind of university, to use this online technology, flawed as it is, to create a free university or an open university, to force our current universities to open up more to even the private universities to be more public and the public universities to be more public. And it's also, I think, a call for all of us to continue, I'd say, and be fierce in our connection of what Barbara called the linking the life of the mind to the life of the street. So I think there are things that we can all do individually, and I'd like to think about collective things that we can do, as well as putting serious pressure right now on our institutions. If we don't do it now, I don't think they're going to stand up. This is their moment. But also imagining, could we create a rethought college that's free, that's open, that's radical? What could we do in this moment? So those were some of the things that I'd love to hear people talk about going forward.
Yeah, and we have our first comment in the chat from Andy Hines, who writes, I'm typing as an undergraduate who's been working with our staff to organize. And from this standpoint, it's hard to ignore the power that working toward a mass strike of some kind. I don't see why petitions and so on would put pressure on fascism, which by definition is not receptive. And I guess that's kind of a question at the end there.
I can hop in, and you unfortunately can't see my union pin that I'm wearing here, but it's Contract Faculty United at NYU, which as of last year became the single largest full-time faculty union at any private university in the country. And hopefully there will be many more that follow us. Of course, public universities, it's very common to have unions. I will plug the rally today once again and say that this is, I think, the largest cross-shop rally that I think anybody who's been involved in this moment of organizing, at least, has ever participated in. I mean, we have more than 20 groups signing on and organizing collectively to bring people out for this march and rally. And I think two things are really important, responding also to Andy's comment in the chat. One is that we start more and more working in unison, and that of course also means private schools with public schools, which is one thing that's just great to see PSC and UAW unions at Columbia Barnard and NYU and the New School coming together. And the other thing that Andy mentions that I think maybe we haven't done as good a job of, although there's been some participation, is bringing staff into our struggle and recognizing that our struggles are interdependent, because the staff also allow us to do the teaching, learning, and research that, of course, the university administration cares very, 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 very little about, but is, of course, the beating heart of the school. And it's only in collaborating with them, many of them also are already in unions, which is advantageous, that we can actually exert the kind of power, that a mass strike can demonstrate.
And also, we have a question from Meredith, who writes, my university does not have a union. How can we galvanize to have any kind of power against the upper administration? And I would say a good place to start is joining AAUP, AFD. Yeah. But if anybody else has suggestions, please feel free.
I think Barbara Foley has her.
Yeah. I like the way this discussion is going. I don't have a specific answer to that last question. That's what we're here for. I mean, the whole premise upon which the CAHE has been working here is really important. And I think Barbara Bowen really stressed the absolute, not only necessity, but the possibility of some significant fight back. Someone a couple minutes ago was talking about how do you deal with fascism? And the question is, how do you deal with fascism? Where does it come from? And what can we do? And this may sound a little scholastic, but one of the things that we aim at in the Keywords Project is to examine the words themselves and see where they open up an understanding of reality and where they may limit that. And I think displacement, of course, is a word of tremendous empirical power right now because it's describing so much of what's going on. But then it's negative. It's this. It's deport that. It's destabilize, right? They're all negative. And the question is displacement questions? Is it part of a binary opposition, or is it a term that can open itself up to being a broader descriptor of the reality that needs to be examined? To deal with that last one, I think the way that William Robson was talking about surplus and surplus populations is useful because, of course, that's from the standpoint of capital. And once we start understanding the standpoint of capital, then we're in a position to see and to try to strategize for how we can overcome capital. In other words, where does social revolution fit into the agenda that we're dealing with right now? And that may sound like utopian and distant, but in fact, I think that concept has to guide us in what we're doing, because the displacement can be seen as part of a binary opposition to which the other part is belonging. All right. And there are real problems with belonging. You can belong to humanity on the one hand, but you can belong to a nation, an ethnicity, and a people on the other hand. And it's that sense of belonging, of course, which then fuels the kind of projection that David is talking about, among Israelis who have been through a grotesque historical experience, but then have converted that into the grounds for projecting, what the Nazis did to them into their own behavior. I mean, I don't want to go on and on and on and sound super scholastic about this, but I think if we see displacement as a term that describes an objective process that is occurring with an impact upon the workers of the world and a motivation on the part of the capitalists of the world, then we can see that it's really part of a dialectic and that we have to understand what the oppositional element is in that dialectic and along the lines that the CAHE is about and the kinds of things that particularly that Barbara was stressing, though I think all of the papers were extremely valuable in illuminating, the current conjuncture. I think that we can really open up the horizon. I said in my opening comments, I'll be done here, that the Radical Caucus is, a ecumenical left organization, okay? But there are some people in it who are socialists, and my favorite word there is communists, okay? And I would count myself as among one of those because we think that this whole system that has generated this absolutely toxic and horrific set of practices has to be done away with. So I would urge us as we contemplate the immediate things that we can do, what kind of larger agenda for change can those possibly be linked to?
William, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of worse off with the tech than Barbara is. I just want to add to, I am wanting to follow up on comment on what Barbara just said about displacement and belonging. Thought dialectically, wouldn't that just dialectically work out through agency of movement through space, right? So rather than being displaced or belonging, it would be worked out through the agency of the subject of history moving through space willfully rather than being displaced. But there's so much more to say. I just
okay.
I just wanted to add a local plug. I forgot to mention that there's a screening, the first in the area in Philadelphia tonight of the encampments at 6 o'clock at Penn. Anyone who wants to know more about that, please DM me.
And William, I see you've been waiting very patiently, so please go ahead.
Hey, so I mean, the big challenge that we always face on our the left on our campuses and our activism is, of course, how we link these struggles on the campuses to the larger struggles in civil society and in the working class. And of course, the struggle for immigrant justice has, although it's it involves our campuses. It's always been more of a movement in the larger civil society, at times a mass movement like 2006, 2007. And now Palestine Solidarity, ground zero may have been during the encampments and still is our campuses, but it's a much larger movement than just in our campuses. But of course, strategically, the biggest thing we need to do is how we link our struggles in the universities to the working class. That's really the to attack the jugular vein. And what Trumpism is doing is this massive, unprecedented escalation of attack on the U.S. and the global working classes, with the attempt here to smash whatever remains of the regulatory state, of the social welfare state, and to fully expel the working class from what was the post-World War II, its incorporation in previous moment. And so, I think Trump is not doing good things, but he's doing us a favor by sparking reactions from the working class. And there's right now mass organizing going on for May 1st. In the UC system, I don't remember if it was SEIU or AFSME, but one of the unions that organize campus workers announced that they're going on strike on May 1st, joining this strike, what's going to be really massive action on May 1st. And this time, not for a specific wage demand or a particular working condition demand, but simply in solidarity with workers. That's simply unprecedented. So I think, the way forward, the qualitative way forward here is to continue to take advantage of this current climate, this massive attack on the working class at all levels, to see how we link our struggles on our campuses to the struggles with the larger working class and all its diversity and all of its contexts. And one other comment, we've seen that there's an increasing corporate takeover of the university. Turning departments into research centers, and that research will be appropriated by corporations, the military industrial complex. We know all of that. But I think what's also going on at a deeper level that we need to think about is that transnational capital has so much colonized the US state used now with the Trump regime, and what's going on with this defunding is something bigger than just punishing us for our Palestine solidarity. What's going on is the idea that instead of funding universities for research, you simply give all of this funding, that tens of billions of dollars, directly to corporations, especially the tech corporations, rather than having to pass through the universities. So I think there's a larger story here about the deepening of transnational corporate control in the context of this crisis, in the context of new political dispensations, which really means fascism and a new type of authoritarianism. So just to conclude, I think on our side, our fight back, really the thing we want to focus on, and which we can do in a new way now, is how to link our university struggles with larger working class struggles. That's happening. We need to deepen it.
Thank you so much for those helpful comments. Tony, I see you've also been waiting patiently, so please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to the speakers. I want to direct a question really to William Robinson, who outlined in such detail what Kristin really defined beautifully as class war, and also the psychoanalytic input into this from David. It seems to me, I ask you this, whether it seems to me that the whole metonymic displacement, right, of victimhood, of class war, of making victims, the victims of accumulation, into predators on the still safe, the still undisplaced part of the population. This chain of metonymic chain of signifiers, and a chain that destroys meaning coming from Trump. Its summary is wokeness, right? But all the little concepts along that chain have to do with criminalizing the already displaced, criminalizing the victims of accumulation, basically, as predators upon the safe, the secure, et cetera, et cetera. So as a relatively safe person, I feel this as a kind of interpolation, at the psychoanalytic level as well as the political level, to refigure one's safety and not divorce safety, our safety, from this chain of displacement and victimhood. And does that not lead to, in terms of action, a recentering of meaning, a re-signifying of the deportee, right, as an organizer, as a center of organizing, as someone whose belonging is to a fighting working class. I mean, certainly the migrant has displayed incredible resiliency and incredible struggle and self-formation, right, in the process of moving against all these barriers. So I think the home care workers of New York City, the largely immigrant women who apply home care, who are organizing themselves and appealing to campus unions, right? Appealing to academic unions for support. All right, I come back to my question. Is there not a chance for us to re-signify this pernicious displacement and destruction of meaning, that you see in the fascist discourse?
A real quick response to Tony's question about, or comment about the migrant as the sort of subject of this resistance. Also the prisoner, and today is Palestinian Prisoners Day. And organizations like Samidun, have been working towards just what I think you described. That's all. Thanks, Tony, for that question.
Yeah, and I'd like to recognize a comment in the chat by Kareem, who writes, outstanding point, William, agree completely. Labor for Palestine is a site where this work is being done and these connections are being made. Labor for Palestine is organizing a massive May Day action, right? So we're seeing some of those convergences on the solidarity in there. But Barbara, please go ahead.
Well, mine was in reference to something else earlier, so maybe it would be great if David and William would jump in, and I'll hold off. Thanks.
I mean, I would just say very briefly, Tony, that when we talk about the historical metaphor of the Holocaust and the power of its weaponization within Israel, I mean, we can't not also think about the power that it holds within our society, which is, filtered through from, Steven Spielberg to every sort of piece of media that is consumed, the metaphorical power of, even using the word Nazi to describe, anybody who you dislike in effect, whose position you despise. That, we could think of a displacement, but really it's an appropriation. It's a sort of cynical, sort of realizing the extreme power that holds as a cudgel for, silencing any form of dissent, and then even, taking really drastic measures like the violent ones that we're seeing here, all in the name of Jewish safety, even when that is the farthest imaginable thing from these people's minds.
Yeah. So let me see.
Nesrine, I'm not sure if William wanted to say anything in response to that. All I was going to say earlier actually was picking up on what William said about solidarity and co-action, David, too, with working class struggles. I think it's important to remember that many of our students are workers themselves. I see a group of, I think, students and faculty on here today. Wake Forest, hello. So fantastic to see a watch party. And I don't know, what other lives outside of the classroom you have, but, somebody who teaches at a non-elite working class university, where the majority of students have family incomes under $40,000 in New York City. I would say almost every one of my students works. One thing that has happened in this attack on higher education is that higher education has been sort of seen and described only in terms of Harvard, Columbia, Penn, and a few other places, a kind of public erasure of the fact that most students, I think it's 85% in the country, go to public universities. A huge portion go to community colleges, and making visible the students who are themselves workers and finding common cause with them as workers. It's not as easy as one would hope, I find, but I think it's important to notice that there's a further stratification of universities and an invisibilizing of some that's going on even during this attack. And all the more reason for all the public and the private, the community and the four-year schools and the graduate and professional schools to take a common stand of resisting these extortionate demands.
I would say also, to go back to Will's discussion of, surplus humanity or surplus labor, as elite colleges, but not only elite colleges, are increasingly made over on the corporate model, we become surplus labor. We become this, this group of workers who, the administration would prefer to, if not entirely precarize, maybe just, if not get rid of entirely, then precarize. I think there is one advantage in that we create an enormous, to speak the corporate lingo, we create an enormous amount of value in our classrooms, doing things that sometimes admin, doesn't recognize, that sometimes ranking systems, which want to increasingly, evaluate universities, and for good reason, because of the cost of university and all the rest, but want to increasingly evaluate universities on the basis of the earning potential of their graduates. That really, misses the incredible value that we end up actually producing in the classroom with our students, and that our students really deeply value. Our students, to again speak the corporate lingo, who are the clients here, and we are the service providers in this relationship, they deeply value that. And so even as that's somewhat degrading to phrase it in those terms, in the terms of, our corporate overlords, I think being realistic, there actually are certain kinds of advantages to educating our students about the structure of the university, which they are almost entirely ignorant of, but I think have, changed. I think that's changing quite a bit, and I don't want to make blanket assertions about that. There are, of course, wonderful students who are very organized and active on our campuses, but for a long time, I think they've been deeply unaware of how the structures operate. And then just responding briefly to something that Mike said in the chat, Mike Golash said in the chat earlier, suggesting that also students' parents, who are not just those who, pay the big bucks, and can be influenced, in those terms as well, but, who work in strategic industries. This is really the sort of no shortcuts model of organizing, which is, we have to make it a community project and a commune project as well.
I have both Barbara and Kristin. Feel free to weigh in.
Well, I'll go quickly. Two things are occurring to me. One is, this is an extremely rich discussion with all kinds of tendrils going in all kinds of directions. I mentioned earlier that the Rad Caucus this summer, spring moving into summer, right, is going to be hosting a series of reading groups. And let me just emphasize that. And if anybody who's in attendance here, who are on the panel, whatever, has some works that they think would really produce clarity for us in this struggle, that would be good. I mentioned we had been dealing with Maya Wynn's book, Towers of Ivory and Steel. It's an incredibly important book, because it describes the ways in which Israeli universities are completely complicit in the whole imperial project. There's, no wiggle room out of it. And that's very, very important, among other things, in supporting the BDS arguments and not saying we should maintain some kind of ties. But so let me urge that people, volunteer to, participate in this project. And if anyone has an idea right now about a reading that we should undertake, that would be great. The other thing is that those people who have decided to stay and struggle and who are still members of the Modern Language Association, we're going to raise some hell. at the coming convention. We're not just going to let them get away with everything that they managed to do last year. And we can arrange for emergency motions. We can arrange for just-in-time sessions dealing with various aspects of the ongoing crisis, so that those people who want to contribute to that activity in an academic professional association, that would be great. And I know that there are people in various academic professional associations. I know that the American Public Health Association, for example, has done heroic stuff around war, racism, incarceration, all kinds of stuff over many, many, many years. So let's not lose heart because PDS got shot down. I mean, we are many, they are few. Remember, some dude in the early 19th century wrote that. So let's bear that in mind. That's all I have to say.
Okay, and we are getting a few questions and comments in the chat, so maybe we'll pause, take those, and then Kristin and then William can chime in. And so the first is from Andy, who says, from your experience in the UAW, for example, what does it also mean if our union leadership are against militancy, no strike clauses, etc.? How does also the struggle between rank and file and bureaucracy play into things to bringing people together in this moment? I will also recognize a question by Adam Miyashiro. He says, hi from Stockton University in South Jersey, where we are joining from a classroom. Our university wrote this statement in LitHub, and we encourage all of you to write your own from your own campuses and communities, and he links it there. The students say Stockton supports you from the class of medieval women writers. The students have no questions, but say you're doing a good job and look forward to this day of action. So those are our comments and questions. And Kristin and then William, if you could sort of.
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to respond to the points that Barbara Bowen raised a few moments ago about the various types of campuses during the encampments. With an anecdotal report from on the ground of the Penn and the Drexel encampments, most of the security, the safety, and anti-police de-escalator marshal types, that was provided around the clock by community activists from often not with college backgrounds or from not as elite college backgrounds. And there was a lot of talk on the ground at the time comparing these encampments, and particularly at Penn, which is an extremely elite university, with what was happening at Cal State Humboldt Polytech, where they were barricading the hell out of the campus and beating officers with water bottles. So at Penn, there were props of those big water bottles, but they weren't actually used. So this was a discussion on the ground. There was a tension, but I think after 3 weeks of living together and creating this community and acting together with community members of all sorts of backgrounds, I think some forms of solidarity arose there in both directions. On one of the very first days of the Penn encampment, in addition to all the teach-ins by professors and amongst the students themselves, were Pam Africa, who was one of the survivors of the MOVE bombing and who's still an activist in Philadelphia, primarily on the Free Mumia Abu Jamal campaign. I believe Mumia himself phoned into the encampment at one point. When Pam Africa came on day 2 or 3 of the encampment at Penn, it was with Fred Hampton Jr., who was in town and spoke to the camp, the son of the slain Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton in Chicago from '68. So there are all these resonances happening. And also many of the community activists that were on the encampments and not Penn students or affiliates were coming from other struggles, some of them having directly to do with gentrification, people who were involved in the townhome struggles, but also the Save Chinatown from the proposed arena, which has temporarily been successful. They've saved themselves from a casino and a stadium and now the arena too. So all of these convergences were happening on the campus. And I have tons more to say about that, but I just want to point to, just before I went to bed last night, I heard news that that there was an encampment that went up spontaneously at Howard University. Students are forming what they're calling People's University. It lasted, it was still going when I went to bed, but apparently it lasted only 8 hours before it was busted up. But this was a Gaza encampment, but broader than that. That's all I know about it, but keep your eye on what's happening there, because they won't go away. And disclosure, I taught at Howard University during the Obama years. That's all I have to say, thanks.
And William, please go ahead, and then I'll share another comment from the chat and then turn over to David.
Well, I wanted to make two comments, and the first is in response to Tony. And I think we need to remember that what the ruling classes do is always in response to what we do from below. This is a dialectic of mass struggles on so many different levels, and the response from above. And yes, and criminalization is one mechanism of legitimating the response from above to our mobilizations from below. If Palestinians simply said, okay, sure, we'll leave Gaza, no problem, you can have this as real estate and as gas and oil, there would be no need to criminalize or anything. If immigrants simply said, when Trump said we don't want them, or before then, if several million immigrants said, okay, sure, we'll just go back to our countries of origins. So all of this that the ruling classes are doing, that the state is doing, is in response and in reaction to agency from below, to mass struggle from below. And let's remember, in this intensification of the war on immigrants, that several high-profile arrests and detentions have been of immigrant organizers, union organizers, and immigrant justice organizers. Lalo in Oregon is a lead organizer. So they know what they're doing, and it's in response to our agency and our struggles from below. So this is reactive. The ruling groups know that there's mass discontent here in the United States, around the world. You have to scapegoat immigrants to have to challenge, to channel that mass discontent towards scapegoated communities. But also the ruling groups fear mass uprisings, and they are coming, and ruling groups are preparing for them. So that's the first thing we have to understand, that displacements, again, in part displacement is to accumulate capital, to open up new spaces and seize resources. But in part, displacement is a response to these mass struggles around the world and revolts around the world from below. So that was in response to Tony. Of course, there's much more to say, but no time. The other thing I want to say in response to how the conversation has been going is, why are the universities facing this unprecedented attack? Really, really unprecedented. And of course, there's the immediate reasons, which we've already identified, including squashing Palestine solidarity on our campuses. But again, I think there's a larger story that we need to pay attention to, because it's the larger story which links this attack on universities to the whole generalized attack on the entire diverse, multi-ethnic, multinational working class. And it is first that, and I think it was Barbara that already said it, Barbara Brown, that universities are hotbeds for the development of critical consciousness and organizing. Yes, that's true. But there's other things going on, and it is that the university has too much autonomy, not just politically, but also economically. It has too much autonomy. And then the third thing going on with these attacks on the universities is deeper and it's structural, but we need to pay attention to it. And it's that mass education emerges in order to train workers for highly technified, high-skilled work in the post-World War II economy. But now with the radical transformation of global capitalism and its digitalization, work is being precaritized and de-skilled, including professional work, including the highest level work. 200,000 computer programmers and engineers in Silicon Valley have been fired in the last 3 years. These things go quietly. They go on quietly. We don't necessarily see them. But increasingly, the university is not really needed except for the production of a small group of highly skilled and high technical work. And moreover, those people should go work for private corporations and the private capitalist universities they're going to set up. So there's a much larger story here of the attack on our universities. And the point here is that it's that larger attack on universities which is really going to, or it could generate the conditions for linking our university struggles with the larger mass struggles of the working class. And finally, I'll say this: remember, part of the strategy of the ruling groups is to impede the development of the subjective conditions for radical response, even for revolution, as Barbara as Barbara said, so that's really key dynamic of what's going on here. How do you impede the development of subjective conditions? Because all of the objective conditions for radical challenge to capitalism are there, the objective conditions, and the subjective are missing. Attack the universities, scapegoat, divide the working class between immigrant and citizen, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the moment we're at.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then Niall says that she's teaching a global health at or she is teaching global health at a top public university, UCSD, where 30% of students are first generation, 50% work and study. Several of my students have had their parents taken by ICE and held in detention, and they're also in danger. The vast majority of my students are students of color who are in solidarity with Gaza. They're scared to be politically active. How can I encourage them to be active and assure them that they will be safe when I'm not sure that that's the case? And then maybe David, if some of your comments kind of speak to that, as well as the point that I'm sure you initially had.
Yeah, well, I did want to respond to what Andy asked earlier. It's a sort of more specific and practical question about organizing with UAW. But I will say, in response to that last question, the punitive dimension of also the cost of education, of the general direction that universities have been moving in since the 70s, all of that, I think, has had a disciplining effect that is, that is much older than what we're seeing right now, and that this is just this kind of a real concentration of all of a sudden with the most recent repression, which is which in a sense makes it all the more remarkable that we've seen what we've seen, given the extremely high stakes of speaking out today. But just to respond to Andy's question, which has to do with sort of like regressive elements, within UAW, within the executive board, within the region very often. I would just say that you have to be organizing within your shop, like with your shop, with your staff, at the same time that you're organizing your actual place of work, right? You have to be organizing your unit, and you have to be organizing within the union you're a part of. And I just, a few examples of that. I mean, the biggest is what's happening with UAWD right now, which the Unite All Workers for Democracy is really the sort of, we can call it the progressive to left faction within UAW, which is being marginalized right now and is sort of actually kind of, fighting for its life right now. I won't comment on Sean Fain's strange sort of tightrope walking with the Trump administration, in recent weeks, but just to keep it more local, 9A, which is the New York region, is predominantly academic workers and legal aides and cultural workers. And we have a few mechanics and retirees, but it's largely, as you can imagine, given that profile, a pretty radical element within UAW. And for that very reason, we are being marginalized by the executive board, and it's a continual struggle. And at the very same time as that's happening, we're seeing the regional, do things that we don't always love. Like, for example, our staff went on strike recently for their own conditions. Our actual union staffers, who many of whom are on 3-month renewable contracts. They're 20-something-year-olds. They're highly energized. And you can imagine they get totally burned out and then just sort of chucked away. And this is, working for UAW, right? And so, you know, we were also this past summer standing on picket lines in solidarity with the same staff that had helped us, you know, over the previous several years achieve a majority. And so I guess, you know, the answer is you just have to be organizing on all fronts at all times. And, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all. Staffers are workers. There were some very out-of-pocket commentary that we saw from you know, armchair communists, you know, saying that union staffers are not workers. Sorry, no, these are the people that, you know, allowed us to achieve what we achieved. They operate under ridiculous working conditions, and we were there to stand in solidarity with them when they went on strike for their own conditions. And so, you know, it's exhausting, but that's, you know, if you don't want to just sort of regress into being a business union, that's what you have to be doing. You just have to be active on all fronts at all times.
Yeah. And two quick comments from the chat before I turn over to Barbara. Tony writes, the encampment, Karimata made this point, re-signified Gaza from victimhood to resistance, and I suggest this is how we should see all the victims of fascist overaccumulation. And Bill Mullen had written, watch for Dave Zirin's interview with one of the Howard protesters later today. So that seems really exciting and worth taking a look at. But Barbara, please weigh in.
Thanks. I was going to respond. I did respond a little in the chat to Niall's really good question. And I think the short answer is that we can't assure students that they will be safe. I mean, I think that that would be not doing them a service. That would be unfair. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't encourage students to be active and help them to be active. And I think part of that is helping students to understand different levels of risk that different people have. I mean, there is some good material out there from ACLU and other places about the what your rights are and different immigration status at demonstrations and things to keep yourself safe at a demonstration. The more armed you are going into that, and I'm not saying you do all this in the classroom, but just in general, the more prepared, I think the stronger you can be. Simple things like role playing before a demonstration have a huge effect. And doing something like that with students can be empowering. I would think, though, that we can't say you're going to be safe. And that's in part what's so moving and incredible about the students who have taken a stand and who knew they were at risk, and they have been punished for that in some cases very severely. They've still done that, but I think there are ways that we can inform students and encourage them at the same time as not scaring them. With that information, contrary to the idea that it might be intimidating, is actually empowering. And the more we can do that for students, with students, I would say, the better. And seeing other students, working together with other students is, of course, empowering.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a quick plug for Campus Sanctuary Network, because they do have really helpful toolkits for like what to do when ICE comes on campus, or how to like word letters to the administration, or what some of the rights that people have are. And so that might be a really good resource for you now, or for your students as well. I think part of it is we're sort of at the early stages of all of this. I think it's only going to get weirder from here. So at this point, it's just, there's a lot of people scrambling to gather information, and there are a lot of lawyers who are trying to do pro bono work, or who are trying to kind of advise on what the status of students, international students, or students without documentation, or what have you, is under the circumstances, so that they have, to my knowledge, the best sort of information on the subject. Go ahead, Tony.
Yes, on the scale of this, I think William Robinson's talk puts it very clearly, right? Not only the capitalist crisis of overaccumulation, the crisis of social reproduction. That's where the university, as he said, that's where the university fits. The existential crisis of the climate destruction. So I would like to just make the point that we are very close to May Day, and May Day is a metaphor for a communist revolution, for the abolition of capital, an abolitionist approach to this system of accumulation, not a tinkering with it. And the more destructive it becomes, the more it becomes necessary to think about the counter-Holocaust, if you want to put it that way, of revolution. So I would just like to say, come to May Day, go to the May Day where you are. I'll put in the chat march in Brooklyn through mostly immigrant neighborhood, I guess with some intellectual gig workers mixed in now through gentrification. It's a march of the Progressive Labor Party, which I'm a proud member of. And I think May Day is a way for us to move away from the whole official discourse of normalcy, which again I identify with fascism, a normalizing discourse, as in Marxist maniacs and lunatics, one of Trump's shorthands for the university. So go to May Day, think communism, think the abolition of capital, join Progressive Labor Party if you're around. It's a legacy party from the 60s, and I'm sure it'll be a tributary to the party that we will need and will build. Thank you all.
Yeah, and I'd like to add Kareem's comment that Palestine Legal, which is a CAHE partner organization, is also offering support and advice for students. So Niall, if you have some of your students who are involved in those causes, that would be a good resource. Okay, and Nellie says, on point the union's participation at UPR, our union is very vocal, but we are in the middle of our first collective negotiation. It's been an emotional roller coaster, very hard. Thanks for the conversation. I think roller coaster is how most of us feel.
Yes, hi, how you doing?
Hi.
Yes. I think it's the best way of describing an emotional roller coaster. Very frustrating, but also when we gain some to sign some articles, hey, we celebrate the small victories. But we are also in the middle of the seeking of a new president for the university. And since we recently changed the governor on the same political party anyways, there's a very slow expectations of very small expectations that the president of the university elected will be in our side. So, we are in constant resistance all the way along. And regarding the diversity and equity and inclusion committee, well, it was dismantled 1 week ago, but we're also resisting on that. But in separate faculties or colleges, like the law faculty was the first in pronounce themselves, including their dean. But in our College of Education, we did that in our own interest, a big group of professors. We are not counting on our dean, since our experience has been that everything remains in information meetings and revolving the same thing and never get to be a vocal a voice in a country. So we decided as a group of professors to develop our statement, and on Monday we're gonna publish it. So the resistance all the way, as I say, and well, I admire you also, what you're doing and all these activities, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Nellie. And just a correction, it's Sanctuary Campus Network. Sometimes I'm typing really quickly and distracted and I just flipped around the words. So apologies for that silly error. And David had said a plug for New Yorkers to come to Foley Square at 4 p.m. With a link to the lineup. And Kristin says, Tony's call for May Day, Philly's demo, is being sponsored by a much broader array of organizations than before, a result of coalition building of the past 1.5 years, largely around Gaza. And I think that's it. I think it's like a lot of interests that have, or groups that have typically been separate, are starting to realize that we all have things in common, and that we're in similar, if not in the same situations.
And I'd add that they need to unite around labor.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say also, Nesrine, you know, the phrase Palestine will free us all is one that I've heard some ambivalence about, expressed, I think, for good reasons. And yet at the same time, this has been a remarkable kind of force, gravitational force in bringing people together and recharging, movements that have long been fallow, if also kept, alive barely, in some cases by folks in the room with us today. And we're grateful to those as well who've kept the fire burning through the dark times. So onward.
Absolutely. All right, well, we have maybe 4 minutes. So if anybody would like to end with some concluding thoughts or share a final comment, now would be a good time to do that. Otherwise, perhaps we can.
Oh, I got one. Free Palestine.
There we go. That's a good one to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nesrine, for moderating, for the presentation, to Barbara and Foley and Barbara, Bowen and William and David and Kristin, and all the contributors of absolutely vital beginning to this CAHE Day of Action. And thank you so much to all the participants, and see you all in the struggle.
I just want to add what an honor it is to be speaking with you and how much I learned from the panel myself. Really grateful for that, and hoping that we can take what we've learned here today and really think about what we can do nationally, because we should not underestimate our power. And that move from seeing something as a victim to resistance is something we have seen very powerfully. We saw it in ACT UP. We saw it in South Africa with Greg Gonsalves' movement about identifying the real cause of AIDS. I mean, there are examples, and let's see what we can do to keep connected. We should not be apart in a moment like this.
Right. Well, and I'd like to thank you. I'm going to duck out and hand over to Jordy because I have to teach my class. But thank you all so much for just an amazing series of talks and comments. I love you all. Have a great day. Bye. Here we go.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. I have nothing to add. We can decide what to do with the recording, and we'll definitely be in touch. Yeah, stay connected is right. Thanks again.
Great work on the rallies. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.